Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll complete our reading of The Delectable Negro by Vincent Woodward. Remember, this text is heavily edited by a white liberal queer person with additional inputs and perspectives from two black queer men. And the author himself was a queer person. I take objection to the title of this final chapter, The Hungry Nigger, because who gave the white editor an N-word pass? But that's just me. At the end of the 20th century, Black gay men began to bravely articulate and embody a suppressed history and politics of the Black male orifice. For example, Essex Hemphill's brazen and anti-erotic manifesto titled Loyalty marked a historic moment in Black sexual politics and cultural recovery. Tracking an epistemology of the anus rooted in Black Christian ideologies and faith practices stemming back to slavery, Hemphill writes, "For my so-called sins against nature and the race, I gained the burdensome knowledge of carnal secrets, a knowledge disquieting, liberating, inhabits my soul. It often comforts me, or at times is miserably intoxicating with the requisite hangovers and regrets. At other moments, it is sacred communion, causing me to moan and tremble and cuss as the Holy Ghost fucks me. It is a knowledge of fire and beauty that I will carry beyond the grave. When I sit in God's final judgment, I will wager this knowledge against my entrance into the holy kingdom." Hemphill writes against the normative logics of nature and race, founding his complaint within the taboo interior regions of the male anus. The anus functions here as a vehicle of erotic coupling, as a site of knowledge apprehension, as a means of existential inquiry, and as a central ground of racial formation. Religiosity and saving of oneself and community figure centrally in the Black epistemology and experience. Through the sacred idea of the sacred relationship to his anus, Hemphill builds upon a legacy of Black people using their bodies and body parts since slavery to reconfigure the precincts of the sacred and the humane. For example, as I have noted, Sojourner Truth, at strategic moments in her oratory career, referred to her breasts and her womb in public speeches. This referencing of her body parts has a dual effect. First, it allowed her to make claims to the spiritual and maternal authority of women from the Bible. And second, it facilitated her challenge to the stereotype of the masculinized Black woman. In the Confessions of Nat Turner, recorded by Thomas R. Gray, Nat Turner also experiences the Holy Ghost as a mediating and corporeal realized presence. And from the first steps of righteousness until the last was I made perfect, and the Holy Ghost was with me. Hemphill experiences the Holy Ghost as anal penetration and as a resultant sacred bloodshed. And Turner also experiences the Holy Ghost as blood, physically manifested in the natural world. I discovered drops of blood on the corn as though it were from heaven. And now the Holy Ghost had revealed itself to me, and made plain the miracles it had shown me. Though Hemphill was not a slave, feelings of captivity and the erasure of his humanity motivate him to articulate a praxis of anal spiritual liberation that has clear antecedents in the inerrant and radical Black Christian systems that Turner and Truth embody. So he's comparing this Black gay experience to our freedom fighters. That's what he's saying. In revising these traditions to include the Black male anus, Hemphill encourages a rethinking of deity, corporal reality, and Black cultural formation in the past and the present. With another eye toward racial revisioning, Ron Simmons, in the same decade as Hemphill, challenged the sexual hypocrisy of the Black arts movement, focusing in particular on Amiri Baraka's homophobia and formulation of a negative anus sexual politics. Perhaps, writes Simmons, it is the homosexual desires Baraka had as an adolescent and young adult that motivate his homophobia. Simmons traces Baraka's malice and violent disposition toward the faggot to the author's vexed experiences with anal sex. Baraka admits these experiences to a hooker named Peaches after failed attempts to achieve erection. I'm sorry. I'm fucked up. My mind is screwy. I don't know why. I can't think. I'm sick. I've been fucked in the ass. The penis and anus represent for Baraka two opposing nodes of Black experience. In his poetry, political writings, and plays, Baraka associates the phallus with male-female coupling, racial solidarity, and Black male heroicism. The anus and anal copulation, on the other hand, represent the erosion of Black male prowess and sexual vigor and the breakdown of racial solidarity. Of course, because we are based in nature, and in nature, it takes a male and a female to create life, and the objective is to create life. Simmons also traces these negative implications of the anus and of the Black gay identity to the ideologies and political practices of other Afrocentric thinkers and leaders, such as Haiki Madhubuti, Louis Farrakhan, Ben Johanninen, and Molefi Asante. So all our heroes, right? All our heroes are the problem. Ultimately, Simmons writes to revise historical misrepresentations and reclaim the anus as a site of liberation of Black people. Audience members, I'm going to ask you, how could the male anus and giving it up be a site of liberation when most males are bending over to a white male? How is that possible? But whatever. Other Black gay scholars and artists have staked out their claims similar to those of Simmons and Hemphill, arguing for a broad understanding of the anus and Black male oral cavity as viable sites of eroticism and Black cultural formation. Gary Fisher, for example, recovers the Black male oral captivity as a complicated site of slave history, historically based trauma, sexual play, and racial formation. Robert Reed Farr also sketches a genealogy of civil American race talk, extending back to the debauchery of the slave master, who has left a raw milk smell of cum on the breath of both the antebellum nigger and the contemporary Black. Charles I. Nero correlates anal sexual activity between two black men on a plantation in the 18th century to the need to rethink in the past and the present are models of the black family and homosexuality as alien to black culture. Black gay men writing at the end of the 20th century demonstrated the culturally challenging and historically problematic nature of eroticized black male orifices. Through their personal sexual politics and appeals to a broader racial political platform, they argued for the need to rethink the genealogy of the black male orifice, to re examine its political import, to decouple the orifice from black gay bodies and sex practices, and begin them in the most creative ways possible to locate black self-fashioning and cultural formation within the eroticized male interior. Now, again, he's saying that black gay men are writing about this. Let's think about plantation life. If two men wound up together that were black slaves, could it be that they were seeking some form of solace and comfort in this hellish environment where their women did not belong to them and where they didn't even belong to themselves? And instead of trying to create a family with a woman who they knew could be taken at any point in time, they created these family dynamics with each other because this was the only type of male they could be allowed to be, was a gay male. As I have argued throughout the book, the black male interior has constituted a highly under-theorized yet impacted region of the black experience. By grounding this notion of the interior in eroticized regions of the male body, black gays have begun collectively to blueprint a way for us to finally and fully begin to inhabit and theorize this idea of the black male interior. Hemphill's luscious taking of the Holy Ghost into his anus, and Fisher's correlating of oral sex hunger with slave ancestry, and Hegel's philosophy of the master-slave dialectic each serve as examples of a rich interior terrain existing just beyond the erogenous threshold. Each artist depicts the black male interior as an erogenous and culturally relevant structure rooted in the body's emotional and spiritual needs. What I want to hone in on and make more explicit in this chapter is the historical tie between the black male orifice and the largely unspoken politics of inferiority. The eroticized anal and oral orifices, in and of themselves, have not constituted a problem for black cultural formation. In fact, black people have, to useful ends, imagined these regions of the male body as surface structures, as demarcating the indecipherable zones of experience. This mode of imagining has facilitated, for example, black men and women of the 1960s equating same-sex practices with seeds of racial death, which was implanted during slavery. For example, W.E.B. Du Bois construed Augustus Dill, the black man arrested for having tea-room sex in the 1920s, as a threat to black uplift and the dismantling of the historically laden color line. In a firing drill, Dill, who was a devoted cultural worker, for his arrest and expressing disdain towards tea-room sex, Du Bois reinforced the idea of the homoerotic anus and the mouth as dangerous corporeal regions that were antithetical to black experience. Now, while we know that these were not antithetical to the black experience, these were not helpful to the black experience. These were not the images of the prototype male and female that we would want to put forth, because unfortunately, two men cannot create life. Two women cannot create life without the intervention of a man. Two men cannot create life without the intervention of a female. From these 20th century examples, we get a sense of the anus and oral cavity depicted in racial uplift contexts as racial grave sites and terrains of experience existing beyond the boundaries of blackness. Such modes of thinking reinforce the notion of the black male erotic interior as empty, as unspeakable and unknowable, as uninhabitable, and as fundamentally antithetical to the black experience. Bringing together the slave past with the present, I used Toni Morrison's Beloved to initiate a discussion of black male interiority in slave history within the collective black memory of slavery. Focusing on what many have referred to as the male rape scene in the novel, I point out some of the limitations and inaccuracies of the term rape. Rape names acts of sexual violation in the novel, but obscures realities of black male sex and sexual appetite. Furthermore, rape, as most conceive of it, gives no indication of the rich interior and emotional life that precedes and follows the sexually violating act. These surface level and more contemporary readings have also involved equating male rape and eroticism during slavery with contemporary black gay identities and sexual politics. Even black gay men, I suggest, are guilty of transposing the historically specific implications of the black male orifice in slave contexts into contemporary registers of gender and homosexual understanding. So we didn't understand the scene in Beloved when the man was raped. We didn't understand the fact that there were these deeper, complicated feelings and emotions happening for the characters in that scene. Or at least that's what the author and his editor would have us to believe. Excuse me. As a solution to this tendency to erase historical specificity and to shine over the depth and rich metaphorical implications of the anus and oral cavity, I suggest that we read the black men in Morrison's neo-slavery novel as suffering from a condition of institutionalized hunger. The black men in Morrison's novel The black men in Morris's novel suffer under the same culture of hunger and human consumption that I have documented throughout this book. In Morris's novel, this culture of hunger takes the form of staged breakfast scenarios, forced oral sex in the context of breakfast, and hungry niggers who symbolize the compound experience of racial and sexual degradation. However, the difference between Morrison's hungering black male figures and, say, Luke or James L. Smith is that they bring us to a much clearer and immediate understanding of black male erotic hunger as an index of internal need, self awareness, alternative gender expressions and social roles, and longing for ancestral and ancient pasts. From this discussion of Morrison's novel, I segue into theorizing the black male interior space. My thinking along these lines is helped by Houston Baker Jr., who has written of this interior space as a tight spot or a tight place. The tight place, as Baker thinks of it, is a place of hunger and black male desire, a zone of homoerotic contact between black and white men, and a site of black masculine anxieties that date back to slavery. Though sexually suggestive, Baker's model does not formally ground this terrain within the male anus and oral cavities. Advancing upon Baker's claims, I ground the idea of the tight place in the homoerotic experience of black men during slavery. In particular, I look at how anal and oral sexual contact between black men on the plantation served as a means of reconstituting African cultural legacies and self and communal identity, the memory of and loss occasioned through the Middle Passage, and the non normative modes of gender expression. Rather than interpreting the anus and mouth as flat utilitarian surfaces, I encourage a model and process of inhabitation of theoretically embodying the black male interior. Only from the perspective of the inside, I attempt to show how can we ascertain the rich, fecund, and reproductive potentials of the black male orifice. He said a lot. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. Thank you so much for tuning in. He said a lot. He said that we have miscategorized black maleness through the eyes of our heroes like Dr. Ben, Louis Farrakhan, Molefe Asante, and others. He says that even though a black male that is gay is usually being handled by a white male, that this is a revolutionary and liberating act that should be praised in the eyes of our liberators. And he also says that we should rethink the male rape scene that happens in the book Beloved because we misunderstood these types of plantation relationships. And he said, excuse me, that we can only understand the potential of the black male orifice if we allow ourselves to expand our minds to think of it outside of the plantation and take it back to Africa, because there are some African cultures where black male homosexuality was normal. That's what he's saying. The rape and hunger dialectic. At the end of the 20th century, the subject of slavery emerged in the hearts and imagination of Americans with haunting acuity. A cluster of novels about slavery and neo-slave narratives appeared at this time. Shirley Ann Williams Desarosa, written in 1986. Gail Jones Corridora, written in 1975. Charles Johnson's Middle Passage, written in 1990. Randall Keenan's A Visitation of Spirits, written in 1989. Octavia Butler's Kindred, written in 1979. Wild Seed, written in 1980, also by Octavia Butler. And of course, Toni Morrison's Beloved. In the visual arts, the work of Michael Ray Charles, Beverly McIver, Renee Cox, and Kara Walker all dealt with racial stereotypes and the historical memory of slavery, the recovery of slave memory, and the issues of racial typing and demonizing originating in slavery. On a grander scale, films such as Sankofa in 1993, Amistad in 1997, and Jonathan Demme's Beloved in 1998 brought the subject of slavery to the big screen and reintroduced the topic to the collective imagination. In this context of remembering and recovering the legacy of slavery, the notion of the black male erotic interior emerged as a recurring and haunting problem for black people. Black people expressed this concern over black male inner life through a range of cultural registers. This included Trudeau Harris's notion of nurturing male mammy figures, Alice Walker's depiction of male rape and coercion in the contemporary plantation of The Temple of My Familiar, written in 1989, and Michelle Wallace's interlinking of black male rape and black grandmothers' rape during slavery. The fear of rape at sea experienced by a black male protagonist in Charles Johnson's Middle Passage conveyed a general black male anxiety regarding issues of black male sexuality during slavery and on the plantation. Finally, as I have already described, there was, within black nationalist spheres, the equating of the male anal and oral cavities with racial dissolution and a death wish stemming back to slavery. These various considerations of black male interior life, though problematically fixed on male rape during slavery, signaled black people as, in a positive way, attempting to inhabit and more deeply embody the legacy of slavery. Morrison has suggested in an interview that the movement of black people away from the trauma of slavery has resulted in the abnegation of certain moral responsibilities. I think Afro Americans, in rushing away from slavery, which was so important to do, it meant rushing out of bondage into freedom. Also rushed away from the slaves because it was painful to dwell there, and they may have abandoned some responsibilities in doing so. In other interviews and writings, Morrison has linked the legacy of slavery to contemporary U.S. fascism, the demonization of black single mothers, and the presence of black people as haunting specters in early American literature. Slave experience, she insists, cannot be forgotten because it continues to have real, determining impact on the present. This legacy of memory is even more complicated and difficult to manage when it comes to the subject of black male sexuality, violation, and homoeroticism in the context of slavery. What we see from one end of the 20th century to the other is a pattern and geography of black migration that charts how black people have had to and have chosen to leave behind the issues of black male sex, sexual violation, and sexual ambiguity. Leaving behind, though, does not necessarily imply never returning to, especially when memory and trauma are experienced as cyclical. According to sociologist Roy Eierman, the memory of slavery has always reemerged in the collective black psyche as a cyclical manner. Since emancipation, the memory of slavery has served as a container of important historical and contemporary events for black people. He writes, without the means to influence public memory, blacks were left to form and maintain their own collective memory, with slavery as an ever-shifting, reconstructed reference point. Regarding the transhistorical significance of slavery for differing generations of Black people, Ironman clarifies slavery has meant different things to different generations of Black Americans, but it was always there as a referent. So, slavery is the fixed point in our history that we all agree happened, and none of us know how bad it really was. As I have pointed out, at the end of the 20th century, the meaning of the slave experience expanded to include homoeroticism and more specifically the topic of male sexual violation. I speak of rape and homoeroticism together as a unit because, as Negro and others have pointed out, there has been, at least since the Reconstruction period, an unspoken correlation within the Black imagination between all forms and expressions of homoeroticism during slavery and the subject of Black male rape. Over time and across cycles of memory, the pain, trauma, and terrifying consideration of Black male rape has overshadowed the distinct and complex ways that homoeroticism impacted and shaped the lives of Black men during slavery. I dealt extensively with this topic of male rape in earlier chapters, but I come back to this theme again in this chapter as a way of more directly naming and more fully exploring the haunting specter that the topic of male rape has become. At this point in the cycle of slave memory that Ironman now delineates, rape operates as a phenomenon that overshadows the historical reality of the past. In terms of the Black male interior, rape, though a real and disturbing historical occurrence, functions as a screen that keeps us away from accessing Black male emotional and erotic life in a complex way. So, because we focus on the buck breaking and the rape and the violent violations that men experienced during our enslavement, we're not looking at how complex and emotional the Black male erotic life was. This is what they're saying. This is what they're saying. Continuing. Morrison's depiction of Black male rape in Beloved is rare in the annals of slave history and neo-slave literature written about the slave's condition. Morrison's depiction of Black men made to perform oral sex on white chain gang leaders contradicted these myths of Black male paternity and stimulated scholars at the end of the 20th century to reconsider the significance and meaning of Black male rape under slavery. Before considering the import and various meanings these scholars may have attributed to male rape, let me first describe and briefly analyze the rape scenario depicted in Beloved. The scene in question begins with Black men awakened at dawn by the sound of a buckshot, and then one by one let out of their cages and made to kneel before the white chain gang leaders. When all 46 were standing in a line in a trench, another rifle shot signaled the climb out and up and above. There were 1,000 feet of the best hand-forged chain in Georgia stretched. Each man bent and waited. Kneeling in the mist, they waited for the whim of a guard or two or three, or maybe all of them wanted it. Wanted it from one prisoner in particular or none at all. Breakfast? Want some breakfast, hungry nigger? Yes, sir. Hungry nigger? Yes, sir. Here you go. Occasionally, a kneeling man chose gunshot to his head as the price. of maybe taking a bit of foreskin with him to Jesus. This scene, unlike any other novel, has occasioned among scholars a crisis in definition and meaning. According to E. Francis White, the black men in the chain gang experienced homosexual rape at the hands of the white chain gang leaders. White conflates contemporary homosexual practices and identities with the sexual treatment of black men during slavery. Noting her own ambivalence towards the topic of homosexuality under slavery, White offers the following explanation of why the topic is so disturbing and best classified as a homosexual act. Saying, homosexuality already had such bad press. Why add to that by pointing to instances which it would be seen as sordid and despicable? Admittedly, the acknowledgement of heterosexual rape during slavery does not make most people think that the entire institution and various practices of homosexuality need to be condemned. But of course, homosexuality and heterosexuality are not parallel and equal constructions. The latter depends on the former for its claim of normalcy. While White quite appropriately sees the privileging of heterosexual rape and the heteronormativity under slavery as problematic, she adds to the problem by conflating the identities and interior lives of the black and white men on the chain gang with contemporary same-sex politics. Her commentary calls to mind Hazel Carby's very useful comments regarding the historical and political specificity of rape, referring to the distinction between the institutionalized rape of women on the plantation and rape used as an instrument of political terror alongside lynching in the South. Carby clarifies, rape itself should not be regarded as a transhistorical mechanism of women's oppression, but as one that acquires specific political or economic meanings at different moments in history. In this case, White uses the notion of homosexual rape to bridge a contemporary understanding of homosexual subjectivity with the particulars of black men made to undergo oral rape during slavery. White conceives of rape as a transhistorical mechanism, and in the process flattens out the historical and cultural particulars of black men raped during slavery. She seems to ignore, for example, the implications of Morris's choosing to depict oral rape over some other form of violation or penetration. Additionally, particular valences of power and self-glorification are invoked in the black men forced to kneel, take semen, and verbally acquiesce to their abuse. White was not the only one to conflate past and present sexual politics in her treatment of Morrison's chain gang scenario. Negro, the black gay critic, refers to Morrison's treatment of black men on the Sweet Home plantation as homophobic. In particular, Nero takes issue with Morrison's failure to imagine erotic sexual ties among black men on the plantation and within broader slave culture. So a gay man is trying to defend homosexuality during slavery, saying, although deprived of sex with women, sweet home men were capable of enormous restraint, and for sexual relief, they either masturbated or engaged in sex with farm animals. Morrison's description of the restrained sweet home men does a great disservice to the complexity of men's lives. Her description reinforces a false notion of a hierarchy of sexual practices in which masturbation is a substitution for intercourse. Morrison's description is homophobic because it reveals her inability to imagine homosexual relationships among heroic characters. By implication, sex with farm animals is preferable to homoerotic sex. So he is complaining that this depiction of these black hero figures as preferring masturbation or animal sex to gay male sex as problematic. Greetings, Forecast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Nero's complaint, more broadly, is that Morrison imagines homosexuality as the most degraded sexual option for black men on the plantation. While he does not directly mention the chain gang scene, which merges sexual violation with homoerotic desire, forms part of the homophobic tableau that Nero finds Morrison's imagination informed by. Nero's point concerning the failure of black people and black women in particular to imagine homoerotic ties among black men during slavery is well taken and reflective of larger historical dynamics that he documents by saying, at best, our understanding of the sexuality of our slave ancestors is fragmentary. We need to uncover more and reread diaries, letters, and narratives to gain a greater understanding of the sexuality of our forebears. At the very least, we need to revise our models of the black family and of homosexuality as alien to black culture. I fully agree with Nero's historical analysis and call for historical revision, but want to challenge the casual manner in which he, like White, draws correlations between contemporary homosexual politics and the particular and local circumstances of same-sex behavior practiced by black men under slavery. Finally, he actually says something that I agree with, because the decision for black males to be homosexual under slavery had to be different. They had different inputs. They had different reasons. They had different rationales for why they would have been homosexual under slavery. The emphasis upon sex and sex practice obscures, among other things, the ways that gender variant behavior and social roles played by black men on the plantation might have shaped their erotic lives. To see Morrison simply as homophobic is to overlook these epistemological and material considerations. In addition, the designation of homophobia obscures the long-standing historical problem that the topic of black male rape has represented to black people. Morrison's imaginative failure is part of a much larger network of imagining and remembering slavery that dates back to slavery and to the first narratives written by black women. From Harriet Jacobs to Pauline Hopkins to Alice Walker and Morrison, black women have throughout history maintained an imaginative fixation upon the specter of black male violation. This fixation, as Nero asserts, has worked to obscure the deeper emotional and erotic realities of black men under slavery. Still, I do not believe that the solution is to completely abandon the topic of male rape for a more pristine or freer dimension of Black male experience on the plantation. If anything, the consistent historical preoccupation with Black male rape indicates the importance of beginning, as Carby suggests, to unearth a deeper, more particularized understanding of Black male sexualization, sexual violation, and interior response to sexual brutality. Derek Scott's treatment of the chain gang scene in Morrison's novel comes closest to what I'm suggesting in the way of unpacking and particularizing Black male rape. After rehearsing the details of the scene, Scott moves to analyze the powerful reactions of African Americans to the scenario, who says, "What is at stake in the intense reactions to Beloved's chain gang episode? I think reactions both convergent with and divergent from the homophobia and heterosexism of the dominant culture in the United States. Is the very manliness of Black men as a matter of fact in history? What is in jeopardy is African Americans' own investment in the truth of Black manhood." Scott's observations call to mind Sojourner Truth's oft-repeated antebellum inquiry, "Ain't I a woman?" which was really "Ain't I a woman's rights?" But that's another conversation for another day. However, in this instance, the question becomes shrouded in historical silence, shame, and gender ambiguity. Ain't I a man? Ain't I a heroic and noble man? Thinking about this very personal statement in a broader, more historically sweeping context makes one wonder, at this late juncture of Black arrival, if it is possible to recover any usable vestiges of manhood and honor from something as unspeakable and unpalatable as the breakfast. Scott refers to the oral ingestion of semen and the spectacle of Black men made to watch, retch, and perform as breakfast. We are prepared to encounter anything and everything else in a scenario of this nature, he notes. But the notion of taking breakfast, the image and idea are too incendiary. What I would like to suggest, though, is that when we think about the breakfast in the broader context of consumption and institutionalized hunger under slavery, we see that the idea of meal taking represents only a small part of a much larger tableau of Black male hunger and self consumption. In the dialogue from the chain gang, the white man says, "Breakfast? Want some breakfast, nigger?" To which one of the Black men responds, "Yes, sir." Again, the white man says, "Hungry, nigger?" To which the Black man again responds, "Yes, sir." Even more incendiary than the allusions to morning meal taking and the staple nourishment that breakfast provides is the Black man's admission to hunger, his being made to hunger. Confronting a long-held historical silence, Morris gives us finally, through the voice of a kneeling, helpless Black man, admission to the reality of Black men made to undergo institutionalized hunger during slavery. Only in brief, oblique moments have Black men such as Frederick Douglass admitted to the reality of slavery causing us to eat our own flesh, to slavery as a non-systemic hunger. But what Morrison does, mainly through the public staging of Black male hunger, is hint at the range of interpretive implications of black male hunger. The hunger serving as a metonymy for needing, wanting, being made to taste, lack, and the taboo desire to be filled. Theorizing the black male orifice. We can better apprehend the erotic implications of black male hunger if we begin by considering the history and genealogy of mouth and black experience. The mouth represents a sacrosanct structure of black cultural production that black people have, for the most part, conceived of as outside of the domain of sexual violation under slavery. For the black male spokesperson, orator, autobiographer, and speech giver in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the mouth has symbolized more than anything the entrance and exit port of freedom and self definition. Slave narratives, inerrant speeches, pamphlets, abolitionist treaties, letters, reportage, poetry, and historical fiction published in the 19th century all serve as examples of how the foundations of Black antebellum experience were laid in speech and literacy. In light of this historical trend, it is understandable that a resistance to thinking about the Black male's mouth as a sexual receptacle would exist in scholarship on the Black slave experience. In Turning South Again, Rethinking Modernism, Rereading Booker T, Houston A. Baker Jr. provides a useful model for beginning to think about Black male orifices as emblems for and receptacles of Black cultural production. Working through the metaphor of tight spots or tight places, Baker defines these zones of Black male experience that have both geographic and erogenous connotations. Jim Trueblood, from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and Booker T. Washington serve as illustrative examples of these tight places, which are sexually and erotically charged spaces. Spaces that antebellum and Reconstruction Black men had to negotiate as they moved out of home communities and into the world. For Trueblood, the father of a sharecropping family in a southern town, the vagina of his daughter is the tight spot that he finds himself in one night as he lies beside her in bed. The tight spot represents a number of economic and historic factors that make life for Trueblood, a poor Southern man, difficult in the post-antebellum era. Trueblood experiences himself as limited and tightly contained as a result of having to labor for a white landowner whose family once owned his ancestors as slaves. Also, constraining our impossible seasonal crop deadlines, an inherited impoverished social status, and the fact that he has no capital and therefore limited social agency. All of these factors come into play on a night in which Trueblood accidentally rapes his daughter, whose vagina represents, in the context of social construction, the impossible task of having to move without moving. A number of Black feminist scholars have taken issue with this idea of the tight space, critiquing both Black men and women for using this structure to glorify and reify the phallus and to label the Black woman's sexuality as a sign of so many unspeakable, vacuous zones within African American experience. Anne Ducille brings a helpful gendered interpretation to bear upon Ellison's Invisible Man and Baker's glorification of the Black male phallus in the novel. Speaking in terms of male and female contexts, masculinist and feminist readings Ducille offers, it may be that at the heart of this controversy lie not only different notions of truth, art, and history, but very different readings of the phallus and the penis. Counterbalancing Baker's reading of the tight place with depictions of father-daughter sex in Morrison's Bluest Eye, Ducille continues. For what Baker is, an aristocratic procreativity turned inward is in Morrison's novel a bolt of desire that ran down Choly Breedlove's genitals, giving it length. What Baker calls outgoing phallic energy, Morrison names inbreeding lust, a lust bordered by politeness that makes a father want to fuck his daughter tenderly. Wow. Ducille's analysis exposes the phallus as the natural corollary to the female tight place. The phallus and the vacuous vagina are the symbolic representations of a long-standing history of Black male and female violence. Both Ellison and Morrison rework an antebellum and Reconstruction dynamic of the castrated Black man and the raped Black woman. Baker adorns and dresses up this history by imbuing the phallus with cosmic potency and positioning the phallus as the organizing, ruling principle of the entire clan or tribe in Afro-America. Morrison, on the other hand, and the other Black women before her, such as Zora Neale Hurston, Jessie Fawcett, and Nella Larson, critiqued this perspective of the phallus in their writings. But one thing that none of these women does, including Ducille, is reconfigure the symbolic framework of the phallus in relationship to the vagina in a way that accounts for the male body also having erogenous orifices, tight interior regions that have a life, symbolic significance apart from the male-female dyad of sexual violation. Drawing on an example from Booker T. Washington's life, Baker extends his thinking on the tight male place into the realm of oral performance and erotic oral fixations in Black men. For Washington, the erotic and historical implications of the tight place coalesce around the prospect of giving a speech. This is not just any speech, it is his famous 1895 address to the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta. Washington makes history with this speech. He is the first Black man in the South to publicly address an influential crowd of Southern and Northern property owners, heads of state, and business persons. Washington experiences terror and anxiety because he knows that the Northern and Southern whites are are looking to him to represent the Negro race and assuage their own anxieties and fears about the Negro's emancipated place in larger society. It is a white farmer who observes and expresses to Washington, saying, "Washington, you have spoken before the Northern white people, the Negroes in the South, but in Atlanta, tomorrow, You will have before you the northern white, the southern white, and the Negroes all together. I am afraid you have got into a tight place. This example from Washington's life provides an example of speaking, vocal execution, combined with enlightened reason, characterizing Black male masculinity in this post emancipation era. We can say also that for Washington, as a former slave, this instance of speaking is further articulation for his emancipated status, and that of all the impoverished Black Southerners whom he represents through his speech. Should he say things politically offensive to Southern conservatives, or offend his Northern, more liberal constituency? He could very easily experience social castration in the form of being cut off economically from donors, evicted from the land on which the Tuskegee Institute sits, and literally lynched and castrated by the same types of whites who ran Ida B. Wells out of town for reporting on the horrors of lynching. Summing up the implications of tight places, Baker describes them as constituted by the necessity to articulate from a position that combines specters of objection or slavery, multiple subjects, and signifiers. True Blood's narrative is produced for a rich northern white philanthropist. Representational obligations of race in America to speak Negro, and patent sex and gender implications, the role of the law as the phallus. Baker describes Washington and True Blood as struggling to come into their own phallic energy in the context of institutional and white male phallic power. He establishes a clear relationship among phalluses, but does not go far enough in locating the male body itself in the tight erogenous regions that he theorizes. True Blood's sexual penetration of his daughter is an externalization of his own tight, highly sexualized predicament. In addition, it is an externalization of the way he feels violated and is made to reproduce plantation and postbellum sharecropping economics. True Blood experiences a type of economic and social penetration at the hands of a number of white men: the plantation owner, the owner of the sharecropping fields, and the northern white philanthropist who takes a titillating interest in True Blood's rape of his daughter. True Blood's violation is unspeakable in the gendered economy of slavery and Reconstruction that Baker works with. So, within this limited context, Baker gestures toward a recurring scenario of male sexual violation, but offers no incisive analysis of Black male orifices as spatial, transhistoric, and especially sexual sites of identity formation. Cautiously gesturing toward the sexual in his discussion of Washington, Baker does note that there existed a deeply homoerotic bond between Washington and all white men, but in particular, and most expressly, between the Wizard of Tuskegee and General Armstrong. He says little more on this topic. His comments, though, lead me to wonder how Washington's homoeroticization of militarized authority overlaps with the implied erotics of his speech. Thinking along the lines of the tight place, I wonder about Washington's mouth, his vocal acumen, as the instrument through which he orally handles and grapples with the violent, coercive, erotic interests of phallic law. So much of African American scholarship is premised on ideas such as the talking book and the recurring tropes of acquired literacy and oral competency in the making of Black masculine identity. In the context of the transatlantic slave trade, Aquino experiences reading the Bible and developing a relationship with Christian deity as implicitly erotic endeavors that serve to reinforce phallic law. We need to begin to account more fully for books and literacy as a means of reinforcing sexual silence at the same time that they enable speech. We also need to account for the particular ways that whites have eroticized the Black male mouth, even in the context of acquiring the habits of civilization. Homoeroticism and sexual knowing, for example, strongly inform the male slave voice and the body in the slave narrative genre. The narratives of Frederick Douglass, Solomon Northup, Austin Stewart, and Moses Roper, among others, are rife with examples of gender variance, sexualized violence, incestuous master slave dynamics, and exposed genitals, buttocks, and backs. In the context of these men's lives, speaking, the mouth, and textual presentation take on an overlapping, erotic significance that has been little noted by scholars of slavery and the slave narrative genre. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. So, what he's saying is that we haven't looked closely enough at slave narratives based on the language of the day and modernizing it to know whether or not homosexuality was present in these texts, because these men were sexualized and subjected to incestuous master slave dynamics. And earlier in the text, we know that Uncle Tom's Cabin was a source of homoerotic consumption for many white people, male and female, where they were turned on by the story, by the punishments, by the lifestyle, by the service that they received. They were actually aroused. Baker's idea of the tight place is important and potentially very useful as it names a concept and mode of thinking about Black male sex that Black men and women have employed for the past 150 years. In 1970, Vincent Harding wrote a landmark historical essay in which he referred to Black history as emptiness, the void, the chasm. He too used Ellis's True Blood scene to characterize the chaos of Black history as female and sexually castrating. In other writings, though, Harding makes clear that projections into Black female anatomy and sex disguise a deeper, more problematic figure, and that is the Black man who hungers, who has the capacity to ingest and interiorize. Harding alludes to himself and to Blacks more broadly, fearing that they will be devoured by inverted sexuality. Harding expressed fears illuminate the importance of theorizing and positively embodying notions of Black male hunger and erotic appetite. Already we have developed a corpus of beliefs, cosmology, spatial mapping, and racial self fashioning based on the intangible, active, yet active presence of the hungering black male. Already the hungry nigger serves as an index of homoerotic and racialized experience, suggesting that our theorizing of race, black male interior life, and homoeroticism need to occur within a closer, more syncretized framework. To counter this spatial logic of the type place as emptiness, void, chasm, and vacuum, we might begin to think in a more concrete manner about the correlation between actual geospatial places and the interior space of the eroticized male mouth and anus. We already have a precedence for this way of thinking. With the example of Washington, we have the erogenous oral region coinciding with construction era claims to tilled and harvested land, to postbellum sites of slavery, and to a sense of Southern homeland sought after by emancipated slaves. In the 60s and 70s, we have eroticized black male anus made to signify black male urban and inner city dislocation. The landscape of plantations and black men sexually violated under slavery, and the home space of a community defiled by the presence and desires of black homosexual men. In the late 20th century, the black male orifice still signifies to many the absence and a culturally threatening vacuity. What I am suggesting, though, in opposition to this logic, is that we can begin to think about male erogenous regions as a constructive place, belonging and presence. I am suggesting that we find in the anus and the oral cavity productive and reproductive relationships to land, landscape, place, home, homeland, and homeland, among other sites. Such a shift in perspective would take us a long way toward realizing the positive implications of the tight place as inhabited, inhabitable, and a culturally productive space. So it would take a lot, he admits, for us to think about black male homosexuality and black male erogenous zones in this way. Each one teach one. Hello, each one teach one. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Hopefully, you're enjoying the text. The black male sodomite. As we move to rethink and historically re-inhabit structures such as the male anus, I think it crucial that we shift our thinking to a relational model. Rather than thinking about the anus of a particular black man, I think it much more helpful to think about the anal copulation between two black men. To think about the anus as a relational structure within the relational dynamic. We can better conceive of the anus and anal copulation as an index of gender identity and social role as a site of black male erotic and emotional hungers as a regenerative space of black cultural formation. So he wants us to see the homosexual aspects of the black male as culturally regenerative and productive. Importantly, this relational model that I described can help us reclaim from colonial American history those black men who were demonized and misrecognized as a result of their committing punishable acts of sodomy. Such reclamation is a crucial first step in constructing a new genealogy of the black male orifice, one rooted in slave history and African cultural legacies, largely obscured through European empire building. Manuel Congo and Jan Creole, whom we have already discussed, were convicted sodomites. They were also important markers of 17th and 18th century debate concerning the meaning of anal copulation between two black men. The public record evinces very few documented cases of sodomy among black men. The 1646 case of Jan Creole and Manuel Congo is one of the first of its type to be recovered by Jonathan Ned Katz in the Gay and Lesbian Almanac, a new documentary. Court officials logged the Creole and Congo case following proceedings in 1646 on Manhattan Island, the New Netherland colony. According to the record, this was Creole's second sodomy offense. The court found him guilty of sodomizing a 10-year-old by the name of Manuel Congo. For reasons that are unclear, Congo was punished and executed along with Creole. Manuel Congo, a lad 10 years old, on whom the above abominable crime was committed, to be carried to the place where Creole is to be executed, tied to a stake, and faggots piled around him, for justice's sake, and to be flogged, sentenced, executed. It might have been the case that Creole and Congo were close in age, causing white colonists to perceive Congo as somehow instigative of the sodomy act. The punishment of both Creole and Congo suggests a correlation to the white way of thinking between black bodies and an innate sense of sexual taint. The sentencing of Congo and Creole occurred approximately 50 years before the Black Sodomy Act of the Quakers was passed. The Quakers felt the need to craft separate sodomy laws for blacks that were probably for blacks that says there were probably occurrence of sodomy among blacks prior to 1706. Webster's Encyclopedic Unabridged Dictionary defines a sodomite as an inhabitant of Sodom, one who practices sodomy. Sodomy is defined as unnatural, especially anal copulation with a human or an animal, and as copulation of a human with an animal, such as bestiality. This broad definition of sodomy was commonly accepted in the 17th century. When Reverend John Cotton was asked to draw up a group of sodomy laws for the Massachusetts colony, he defined sodomy as an unnatural filthiness to be punished with death, whether sodomy is carnal fellowship of man with man or woman with woman, or buggery, which is carnal fellowship of man or woman with beasts or fowls. Both Cotton's and the dictionary definition of sodomy are rife with historical and cultural presumptions. There is the obvious reference to the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. There is an embedded hierarchy of species, wherein humans predominate over animals. There are also, in these definitions, embedded assumptions that about natural biological functions. Anything connected to excrement is filthy, and the anus is understood as always and only an eliminative organ. And whether or not Creole or Congo came directly from Africa an issue that I will shortly take up. Their case marks a moment when whites, among themselves, contested the meaning of the African body, some interpolating it into Christian Puritan reality and legal and theological discourses. Blacks were denied humanity, but in the context of sodomy laws and persecutions, were clearly held to a marginal peripheral status of humanity and sexual identity. Importantly, the white American interpretation of the black sodomite served a political end that involved furthering the goals of empire building and chaining the African body to a framework of spiritual and corporeal taint. In spite of the power of life and life shaping influence of the state, we should not forget, though, that there were other meanings and implications of anal copulation, meanings that stemmed back to African homosexual practices and plantation culture and the politics of resistance. Reinserting the black sodomite into the narrative of cultural formation challenges the antebellum and 19th century myths, ideologies, values, and social practices generated by black people. Mm. Also, the black sodomite helps us to get at and unpack the implications of blackness, of Anglo Africanness, and Negroness that functioned as a homoerotic category long before 20th century sexual politics or the labor of 19th century black persons to cast the race in the mold of the virile black male and the fecund maternal black female. There is also a race, womb, and myth of cultural origins embedded in Congo's anus and Creole's penis, or Creole's penis and Congo's anus. The broader implications of Congo and Creole's sex spanned the Atlantic and had roots in indigenous African patterns of homosexuality and gender fluidity. Through Manuel Congo's name, we can ascertain something of his roots, his African cultural lineage. Congo's surname is a reminder of a lush, humid Bakongo region of Central Africa. Even today, Central Africa has the continent's densest forests and a climate of high temperatures and heavy rainfall. Africans brought to the Americas often retain, in name, some hint of their geographic locations. A slave often retained a first name or surname such as Congo, Kwa, Sissa, or Zambo to signify their literal or ancestral connections to a specific part of Africa. Either the slave himself, or in many cases the master, chose to keep this name of identification. Most likely, Manuel Congo, or an ancestor of his, came from the Congo, which is the Bakongo region of Central Africa. The Bantu Bakongo people of this region maintained complex patterns of gender variance and homosexuality that influenced patterns of religious worship, social roles, kinship ties, and a range of other relational patterns. For example, the Bantu who lived along the Congo River in the early 18th century maintained flexible gender frameworks. According to French Jesuit Jean-Baptiste Labat, who served among the Bantu, certain males wore female clothing and were referred to as grandmother in certain sacred and ceremonial contexts. Labat, true to his Christian training, describes a man who lives as a Ganga Ya Chabanda, an infernal servant of licentiousness and an expert in demonology, saying, "A shameless, impudent, lewd man. He dresses ordinarily as a woman and makes an honor of being called the grandmother. Whatever bad action that he might commit, there is no point of law that might condemn him to death. Also, he is one of the very loyal ministers of the demon of impurity. The privileges of his character go so far that one is not able to say the outrages that he does to married persons, may be with their women, may be with their concubines." So there was a person who embodied negativity and badness in African traditional villages. This makes sense because everything had an expression and we needed someplace for the bad to go. And sometimes it would impact you. But a white person looking at that only observes what he observes without knowing and understanding why this was happening. The Ganga Yachabanda, according to the missionary, copulates with married men, their wives, and their concubines. His or her sexual appetites know no bounds. From the missionary's stereotypic demonizing and sexualizing of the Ganga Yachabanda, we get the sense that this figure had a dual gender role and social function. It is hard to surmise from this account whether this person was possessed by a female spirit or inherited his or her responsibilities through the female bloodline. But clearly, a person enacting this social function reflected spiritual and ancestral affiliations. In many Western and Central African cultures, the grandmother, as the embodiment of the institution of motherhood, was a respected and feared person. This woman could elevate or erode the moral and material foundations of a community. The grandmother, at the level of the womb and social regeneration, mediated between the human community and the ancestral maternal legacies of the clan or group. So again, they were looking at something that they didn't understand. The Jesuit priest translates gender variance into a sexually licentious act. The priest links Ganga Yachabanda's role of keeping the ancestral shrines and presiding over ancestral practices with demon servitude, impurity, and by extension, the impurity of same sexual and heterosexual acts. The Jesuit priest's sexualization of Ganga Yachabanda coincided with French interests in land, minerals, and slaves during this time period. His comments exemplify how colonial discourse of Black homosexuality existed long before Africans arrived in the Americas. This discourse did not use the language of sex and sexual practice. Rather, it embedded homosexual deviance within a larger conceptualization of the deviant nature of Africans. Other priests and missionaries made more overt connections among homosexuality, gender variance, and the transgression of Christian tenets and values. Jesuit priest João dos Santos, who was in the Congo region in the 17th century, observed a type of man referred to as Chabadi. He writes, "Certainly, Chabadi, which are men attired like women and behave themselves womanly, ashamed to be called men, are also married to men, and esteem that unnatural damnation and honor." The priest Gaspar Azavarudi and Antonius Sequarius during the same period also encountered chabatos, who dressed, sat, and spoke like women, and who married men to unite in wrongful male lust with them. In Western and Eastern Africa, other groups, such as the Bakongo, linked homosexuality with social function. In Kenya, the Meru people have maintained the role of Magawe for centuries, if not millennia. The Magawe is a powerful religious leader who is considered a complement to male political leaders. The Magawe wears women's clothing and women's hairstyles. In another example, the Kwanyame people of southern Angola acknowledge the Kimbanda as an important gender variant person. The Kimbanda, according to ethnologist Carl Esterman, is essentially a man who has been possessed since childhood by the spirit of a female sex. The Kimbanda, or Masingi Kimbanda, dresses like women, do women's work, and contract marriage with other men. The Ganga Yachibanda and the Omasangi Kimbanda were maternal types. Their respective societies acknowledged their maternal capacity by having them dressed in the clothing of the female sex. With each of these figures, clothing functioned as a powerful indicator of social class, gender role, and even spiritual orientation. Even more revealing is how social institutions, religion, cosmology, and gender norms acknowledge the maternal impulse in the male. These individuals and their creative dual gendered capacities did not exist in isolation. Rather, they existed in social contexts in which sexual orientation and gender configuration were thought to originate in spirit in the pre material world. The Ganga Yachabanda had obvious connections to the dead and perhaps also to a maternal bloodline or a maternal ancestor, hence the designation of the grandmother. These Central and Eastern African linkings of maternity and homoeroticism provide one means of interpreting the absence of information on homoeroticism in colonial America. This issue of information reflects not only the status of the historical archive, but also our theoretical and social frameworks that make sense and meaning of homoerotic behaviors that occurred among Black persons in colonial America. With Creole and Congo, the Black men that originated this discussion, we see how Western systems of law and Christian fundamentalism dictate the meaning of the homosexual act and disconnect Creole and Congo's bodies and desires from a larger diasporic interpretive framework. It is of vital importance to know if either Congo or Creole understood themselves as fulfilling a female or maternal role, and if that role took meaning from African cultural forms. Within the sexualizing logic of sodomy law, we get nothing of the intimate and spiritual ties that might have bonded Congo to Creole and dictated the nature and significance of their bond. Did they live together? Did they share economic resources and acquired capital? What acquired capital? This was 1646, and they were Black, and one of them was 10 years old. Did other members of their slave community acknowledge and sanction a bond between them? Along with Creole and Congo, other Black men were also convicted of sodomy offenses. These men could easily fit into the diasporic framework suggested through Congo. Someone such as Mingo, alias Cock Negro, had a suggestive African first name and was executed for forcible buggery in 1712. With Cock Negro, we have even less information about his affectional or social ties to other men, and black men in particular. This should inspire us to look more deeply into the implications of his being crafted through legal discourse into a figuration of sodomy. At a more basic level of libidinal drive and need, I wonder about Creole Congo and Cock Negro as emblems of black male hunger for self and other. In particular, I am thinking of the emotional and erotic hungers that drive these young black men to risk death in the pursuit of erotic pleasure. They all, in their own ways, surely hungered for deep connection, for familiarity and intimacy, for warmth and communal ties. Hunger, unlike need and even desire, taps into those libidinal urges that sustain and drive the organic being. To think of Creole and Congo as hungry in the way that I am suggesting also opens us up to the theoretical and erotic implications of their satiation, their momentary fulfillment, their pleasure as an index of survival praxis and cultural renewal. So he wants us to wonder whether or not these people, in practicing homosexuality, were in some way being revolutionary or rebelling. Coming back to my earlier point concerning the relational hunger as I am thinking of it, is fundamentally a relational construct. It is significant that Creole and Congo are both young black men rather than a young black man and a white man. As young black men, as two persons sharing the bonded condition, both young men had access potentially to a common field of cultural or an ancestral experience. In such a context, the act of anal copulation might have served to unify, reconstitute, and regenerate self and society in ways that were particular to the circumstances of bondage. As symbols of sameness and erotic reciprocity, Creole and Congo provide an opportunity to think about the anus as a generative place. As the place, the anus serves as a site of ancestral memory, of African customs and general practices that perhaps informed the relation between Congo and Creole. Africa, as symbolic and geographic region, brings into greater focus the positive aspects of black male hunger, of black men made to hunger in the context of slavery. In addition, intersecting the geography of Africa with black male interior life makes available to us a rich and largely unacknowledged terrain of black cultural formation. Through Creole, Congo, and their act of anal copulation, we get an expanded sense of gender and relational dynamics on the plantation, erotic modes of resistance and self-generation, and the black male orifice as a space constituted through mutual need and desire. So that is an interesting way to look at it, because were these young boys practicing some way of being that they learned from an African elder? Was it necessary for one of them to be the girl? Was this some type of practice that they had learned? We don't know. But what we do know is that in plantation, uh, in a plantation setting under slavery, they were not allowed to act out their desired roles. And who knows if they actually had a desire for this type of sexual activity. Because again, we're talking about a 10-year-old and maybe a 12 or at the most 16-year-old, because they were considered to be age mates. So why would they have this desire to act out these types of behaviors? The anus in diasporic context. Through the tight and seemingly confining space of the anus, we find ourselves navigating the Atlantic and quite seamlessly engaging in issues of cultural origins and racial meaning at the heart of Black experience. This journeying through the anal cavity conveys the inherent potential of the Black male orifice to complicate and advance our inquiries into the Black Atlantic self and Black diasporic experience. So recognize, I want you to think about this, that by entering into something through a tunnel that is usually meant for evacuation, you're going to see the dark, grimy, slimy underbelly of what it takes to make up this entire experience. Black Atlantic or Black diasporic studies have greatly furthered our understandings of the ways African cultural practices have remained viable in the context of the new African world. In The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, Paul Gilroy uses the emblem of the ship to symbolize migrational shifting, the moving between two great cultural assemblages that marks the nature of Black Atlantic culture. He focuses mainly on routes of cultural sharing and transmission that move along the ancient arc of the slave triangle. Throughout the slave trade, but especially during the first two-thirds, slavery commerce was a Black Atlantic phenomenon, a cultural sharing. Slaves would come from Africa to the Caribbean. Slave traders would then transfer them to ports in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Louisiana, among other places. Sometimes whites would take slaves from American ports to trade in the Caribbean or off the coast of South America. African based same sex practices also migrated within this framework. Gilroy uses the ship, the commodities ship, the coastal ship, and the slave schooner to symbolize the legacy of the Black Atlantic. The image of two Black men in an intimate embrace, an anal embrace, calls our attention to those first bodies held together in the ship. There is perhaps no more intimate and formative moment for Black people than that moment. Women chained to women and men chained to men. If the ship captures a legacy of movement, of in between consciousness, then joined Black male bodies, either through chains, terror, mutual dislocation, or anal intercourse, registers the effects of this movement on the body, the emotions, the psyche, and desire. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Black homoerotic body was a symbol of permanent rupture, a rupture in the very meaning of and ontological foundations of the African body. For no longer did variance and fluidity lend this body multiple roles, sexual preference, and social significance. Instead, in the context of slavery and colonial expansion, this intimate erotic space between two black men became a symbol of loss, of disconnection from Africa, and of deviance within black communities. In the biography of a runaway slave, the Cuban slave Esteban Montijo depicts an alternative genealogy of black same sex behavior. Montijo's biography records how same sex identified black men were tolerated and to a great extent integrated into various aspects of 18th century Cuban plantation culture. Montijo, like Harriet Jacobs, uses black hero homoeroticism strategically. He uses it to prove slavery a dehumanizing, culturally debilitating institution. Referring to homosexuality, he admonished, in my opinion, it didn't come from Africa. Old men didn't like it at all. Old men wanted nothing to do with them. Them means the effeminate men who partner with more masculine men on the plantation. Montijo links effeminacy and acts of sodomy among black men to a much larger context of forced intimacy. These violences, rape, seasoning pens, physical beatings, and language disruption, are to blame rather than the pristine paternal legacy of Africa. In Montijo's cosmology, the effeminate black male slave is a symbol for rupture and disconnection. This male becomes one repository for the collective treatment of black men under Cuban plantation culture. Black men ruptured from land and language. Black men held together with chains, vomit, and feces. Black men broken in seasoning pens and made to share the mutual secret of their degradation, of constant, permanent subjugation. Ironically, the effeminate black male becomes the means of forgetting and simultaneously remembering Africa. For the old men from Africa who wanted to have nothing to do with them, the effeminate men, such men clarified what Africa was in their imagination, an idyllic place of male female conjugal unions, a place where men did not make a house together. According to Montijo, elder African men recognized nothing of their native Yoruba, Bantu, or Kikongo lands in such persons or the domestic relationships they formed. These elder men associated the effeminate male, insofar as he associated with the pain and mangling circumstances of slavery, with forgetting Africa, not being true to the noble legacy represented by the old men. Through the ancestral authority that he invests in the old black men, Montijo establishes the word effeminate within black Cuban cultures came about after slavery. So what he's saying is that after slavery, this word effeminate came about. In the early 19th century, for example, we see homoeroticism, the black penis inside the anus, figured into the cosmology and memory of Africa, making black men have unwilling and willing sex with white men did not encourage such thinking. Such acts were usually blamed upon plantation culture and the malformed appetites of white slavers. So you see that even right there, they acknowledge that this is not who black people are. This is the malformed appetite of white slave owners. However, African men making love to and being loving with one another brought African legacy into view more centrally. What Montague thinks of as a culturally dead space, the anal, emotional, erotic tie between two black men, I would like to, for a moment, think about it as a reproductive space. In particular, I would like to think about the effeminate men that Montague describes as possessing symbolic wombs, regenerative spaces of their hearts, bodies, and minds. For even in Montague's mind, such an erotic connection between two black men is charged with memory and lineage and African cultural legacy. As with the Ganga Yachabanda and the Omasinge Kimbada figures, the effeminate man plays a womanly and even maternal domestic role, tending and perpetuating the psychic and economic well-being of the domestic space. Montague argues that male wives and their husbands signify a break with all things African. But I want to shift the dialogue and think in terms of continuity and calibration. So he wants to change how we think about this perspective. The intimate sexual space shared between the black men that Montague describes translated into domestic spaces and economic partnerships. Speaking of life on the plantation, Montague recalls, to make a long story short, life was lonely. Anyway, because women were pretty scarce. And to have a woman, you had to be 25 years old and lay in her field. Many men didn't suffer because they were accustomed to that life. Others had sex with each other and didn't want anything to do with women. Sodomy, that was their way of life. Those men washed clothes, and if they had a husband, they also cooked for him. They were good workers and were busy tending their coconuts, coconuts, coconuts. They gave produce to their husbands to sell the waritos, and the word effeminate came about after slavery because that situation continued on. More significant than the question of whether such behaviors originated in Africa is the way such black male intimate spaces held the potential for redefinition, self ownership, and a fluid model of plantation masculinity. In the mercantile economics of slavery, black men making house and sharing resources signaled a radical break from the numerous structures designed to diminish and deviate black male productive injury. Montague's description of the effeminate men and their husbands suggests a hierarchy and range of masculinities. There is the effeminate black male. There is the male who is more masculine and partners for men for life. There is the male who is more masculine but chooses to partner with an effeminate man only out of circumstance. From Montague's narrative, we cannot know the full range of combinations, the ways perhaps that effeminate men the way that effeminate men partnered with one another, or a so-called masculine man chose to partner with both a womanly man and a biological woman. Furthermore, we do not get from Montague's perspective a sense of how effeminate men worked alongside and in relationship to women. There were not a lot of women in these situations, but there were some. And certainly, following the abolition of slavery in Cuba, more women were readily available to men who were not kept from women by the Spanish men who had previously owned them. Montague makes no mention of the effeminate male's dress or affect, but it might be important to know how such men dressed, what flourishes in coiffure, what flourishes of coiffure, jewelry, and clothing they wore to signify their wifely status. Montajo's narrative offers ample evidence of continuities between Western and Central African cultures and the plantation values and cultural practices he describes. Throughout his narrative, he refers to religious practices, work habits, and skills, and folklore as coming from different parts of Africa. He notes that most of the slaves in Cuba came from either Yoruba land or Central Africa, the Bakongo region. His own grandfather, Jin Congo, comes from the Congo region of Central Africa. He says that his father was Lukimi from Oyo, the Oyo region of Yoruba land, and the location of one of the once prominent Oyo Empire. J. Loran Matori has written extensively about what he calls transvestite types among the Yoruba in the era of the Oyo Yoruba kingdom and empire. The Yoruba maintained a fluid and complex gender system in which male Shango priests wore the clothing and hairstyles of women and were understood to be the brides of the king and the thunder deity Shango. Yoruba cosmology and lore are rife with examples of men changing into women, women changing into men, women with penises, and males with reproductive genitalia or vaginas. In addition, a significant number of the enslaved population in Cuba came from Central Africa. As I have noted earlier, if we look to Africa, there is a definite cultural precedent for men on American and Cuban plantations to act as domesticated wives to husbands who traverse the public domain. Throughout the African diaspora, pockets of culture emerge that we catch only a hint of through examples related to Montajo's narrative. From plantations in Bahia, Brazil, there is also emerged documented examples of cross-dressing, effeminacy, and same-sex eroticism directly linked to African cultural practices. Francisco Manicango's behaviors were so profound that they came to the attention of agents of the Portuguese Inquisition stationed in Brazil. Portuguese Inquisition officials document Manicango's exploits in first visit of the Holy Office to the regions of Brazil, den, denunciates denunciations of Baha'i 1593, 1591 to 1593. He says, Francisco Manacango, a cobbler's apprentice, known among the slaves as a sodomite for performing the duty of the female and for refusing to wear men's clothes which the master gave him. Francisco's accuser added that in Angola and the Congo, in which he had wandered much and of which he had much experience, it is customary among pagan Negroes to wear a loincloth with the ends in front, which leaves an opening in the rear. This custom being adopted by those sodomite-like Negroes who serve as passive women in the abominable sin. These passives are called jimbanda in the language of Angola and the Congo, which means passive sodomite. The accuser claimed to have seen Francisco Manicango wearing loincloth, such as passive sodomites wear in his land of the Congo, and immediately rebuked him. So what much of this is saying is that although there were some sodomites in Africa that dressed like sodomites, the old men on the plantation didn't want to be reminded of that. So we don't have an explanation for why they didn't want to be reminded of that, but they wasn't with that. Greetings, APTV 13 Keys. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Along with familiar practices of demonization, we have in Monacongo another example of gender and sexually deviant black men interpolated into a European framework of sexual deviance. Monacongo's treatment in the context of the Portuguese Inquisition parallels that of Manuel Congo and Jean Crioli a century later in colonial America. This patterned European response to differing African codes of gender and sexuality conveys how crucial the management of African bodies and erotic desires was to the consolidation of European imperial power in the Americas. The author and his editor are saying that maybe homosexuality was more prevalent in African societies, which were more tolerant of these alternative gender sex norms, and that it was important for them to consolidate and to control African gender identity so that they could have this colonial empire. More to the point, we see that Europeans developed implicit strategies aimed at containing the erotic significance of the male anus and the socially transgressive implications of anal sex. In Monacongo, anal copulation coincides with his gender variant dress, his choosing to do the labor of the female sex, and his maintaining cultural practices that originate, in part, from Central Africa. Throughout this chapter, I foreground the gender variant or passive figure only because this person has received so little attention in our scholarship on slavery in the Americas and in other parts of the African diaspora. However, despite my focus on this type of black man, I do not wish to preclude broader considerations of black masculinity and of black men performing a range of interlocking roles and erotic functions in the context of plantation life. Montajo, a military man and soldier in the Cuban War of Independence, would have his views of masculinity shaped by notions of valor, images of soldiers, images of soldiers as saving women and children, and ultimately returning home to propagate and rebuild the nation. As for the black men who fought in the U.S. Civil War, participation in the Cuban War of Independence promised greater social belonging and civil acknowledgement. Nevertheless, Montajo's notion of nation, family, and paternity strongly mimicked those of the Spanish imperialists who were overthrown in the Cuban War, for that matter, those of the English, French, and Portuguese. Because of his prejudices, we cannot know how effeminate men contributed to child rearing or how perhaps they perhaps enabled physical and cultural resistance. From Montajo's recollection, we can safely deduce that multiple models of the domestic sphere existed. Family was a creative entity that was defined in a number of different ways. Gender was flexible and homosexuality was complex, breaking down effeminate and masculine men into men who chose to partner with a feminine male, biological women, or in some cases both. Montajo speaks from a male identity that arises from the colonial paradigm, so that while he was helped that while he has helped to create a social reality that survives and thrives beyond Spanish occupation, he still occupies and employs the gender and mythic reality of the Spanish colonizer. His mythology of masculinity is one whose creativity and reproductive potential stems from the phallus and the phallic based institutions of the military and the church, among others. Yet, gender variant figures, such as the male wives depicted in Montejaro's narrative, suggest that the phallus and phallic ideology were not the only nodes around which cultural resistance cohered. The dimorphic view Montague occupied existed alongside a more flexible reality of the male female man. This man who could substitute for a biological woman and existed somewhere between or beyond the idea of two biological sexes. In a number of the plantation contexts I described, the anus and anal copulation symbolize cultural continuity, alternative and creative relational bonds, and sites of resistance to the dehumanizing and emotionally numbing circumstances of slavery. Beginning from the assumptive framework that the eroticized anus and oral orifice are sites of agency and Black cultural formation requires us to rethink so much of what we have accepted as norms of desire, biology, race continuity, and cultural origins. Even with the expanding and prolific body of work on Black slave experience, we should still know that we have only just begun to fully delve into the more complex and difficult to articulate regions of Black experience under slavery. Mm. So what he's saying is that under slavery there were various types of masculinity. There were feminine boys, there were masculine men who chose to be with men, there were feminine men who choose to be with men or women. There were a variety of their masculinity was on a spectrum and a scale. Greetings, KW 7. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Masculinity was on a spectrum and a scale. The same groups that went to Cuba and Brazil from the Bakongo region, Yorubaland, Sierra Leone, and Gambia also came to the United States. So we should think about the Monacongo and the effeminate men that Montague describes as related to the diasporic genealogies and cultural significances embodied in men such as Congo and Creole. What I have tried to show by placing U.S. figures such as Congo, Creole, and Cock Negro in a transatlantic context is that we can and should think about Black male erogenous zone during slavery as a diasporic site, a site of cultural formation informed by the geography of the slave triangle, Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. In fact, in the antebellum period of the United States, Blacks maintained a diasporic politics that involved traveling to and connecting culturally with places such as Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, and Brazil. Frederick Douglass served as U.S. ambassador to Haiti. In Blake, or The Huts of America, written in 1861 and 1862, Martin R. Delaney wrote of the political ties between blacks, U.S. blacks, and the people of Cuba. Enslaved persons in the United States frequently escaped to Mexico. David Walker, the black abolitionist, spent the last portion of his political career traveling between the United States and West Africa. There is already precedent for thinking about Black men during slavery as occupying and emotionally inhabiting the diaspora. What I am encouraging, though, is a deeper exploration of habitation, of the loss and longing that dislocation encouraged, of that profound hungers to belong, to have a homeland. I am imagining a tableau of Black experience that includes the experiences of Monacongo, Negro, and Congo alongside those of Montague, Walker, and Delaney. All of these Black men, under varying circumstances of U.S. slavery, wrestled with the regimes of Christianity, contended with the erotic and homoerotic interests of the state, and were made to hunger for self and a larger sense of communal belonging. What figures such as Congo and others bring into focus, though, is how we have largely overlooked the interior and erotic dimensions of these Black men's struggles. At varying points throughout this book, through the examples of Douglass and Sandy, Turner and Willis, Baldwin and the Black men from the 10 Black Writers Respond, I have alluded to the relational and erotic ties that have bound Black men to one another throughout history. We should not limit our understandings of anal and oral copulation to the specifics of the sex act. Rather, it is my hope that we will begin more broadly to marshal the relational implications of these sex acts and use these energies to reconfigure and remap Black masculinity, Black male interior life, and even the implications of the Black Atlantic and Black Atlantic experience. Our new first priority should be the mapping and excavating of the interior, where we have feared to expose our deepest hungers and libidinal drives. We should now see these energies and domains of experience as guideposts and indicators of a new and vital terrain of Black experience. And that is the end of the Delectable Negro. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't. Um, because he had multiple definitions for consumption, and he himself became a consumer of the Negro in his desire to articulate and express all of these different aspects of Black masculinity, from the effeminate to the fully masculine, any of which could have an experience with a man or a woman. I am putting the link in the chat in case anyone had anything they wanted to say. But what I think the author was trying to express is that homosexuality and gender fluidity, they go together, existed in Africa before colonialism happened to the continent. And because they existed in Africa before colonialism, some of that behavior, some of this gender fluidity, these male grandmothers and these effeminate boys and men carried over to America, to Brazil, to Cuba, to all of these different places. And what he's asking us to think about is whether or not our ideas of masculinity are vestiges of our colonial experience and our enslavement. What he's asking us to consider is that maybe we're so rigidly against homosexuality, or at least that's the narrative that he's put forth. We're so rigidly against homosexuality because we're still colonized in the mind. I say, as I said in my post a few weeks ago, Black people largely don't care what your sexual identity is. Black people largely don't care who you decide to sleep with. The challenge is that what you're not gonna do is put that off on our babies and put that off in front of our children and present it as some type of alternative to a male female relationship before that child is ready to consider sex. You're not going to put it in their cartoons. You're not going to put it in their little shows. You're not going to sprinkle it into their consciousness before they even begin to understand who or what they really are. Something that he did not address, a lot of people that experience same-sex desire were touched as children. We know that. That's what the statistics say. Donnie McClurkin, the preacher guy that sings the song "We Fall Down But We Get Up," who keep falling down into the arms of a man, was touched by his uncle as a child. He had these cravings and this appetite implanted in him. So he didn't touch that subject at all. All he said was that the black person is a lot to consume. Black people are delectable, whether we are consuming ourselves, whether we are being consumed literally, or whether we are being consumed socially. That's all he said. And I think that we need to think about that when we are looking at and ingesting our media, because our media continues to offer us a feast of black deplorable behaviors and denigration and different aspects of black violence, black on black violence. And as they continue to offer that diet to us, we need to know that that is not all that there is, and we need to stop ingesting. We need to turn our plate down and away from this social consumption of black people are horrible, so that we can tap in and realize that we are the arbiters of our fate. We are the ones that decide how we are portrayed in the media. We need to decide that we don't want to just be portrayed as villains and monsters and murderers and mass shooters. Because guess what? White women produce more mass shooters than black women. So that's all it is to it. All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed this text. It looks like we're going to be reading Burn Down the Master's House next, but I have to go see if my local bookstore has a copy because I don't have a copy yet. So I'll be back not this Thursday, but I'll be back next Tuesday with the book, whether they have it in stock or not. Because last time I checked, when I checked last week, as I checked today, as I was getting the results in, they didn't have a copy in stock. So, I like to support black owned businesses. So I'm going to go to another black bookstore to see if they have a copy of it. So our next read will be Burn Down the Master's House, which is also written by a queer black man, but I don't think that he's putting his sexuality on Clay Kane. That's what I think his name is. He's not putting his sexuality on display. He's not putting his sexuality on display the same way that this author did. Thank you so much, Sister Raw and the elders. What's next? Yes, Burn Down the Master's House is what's next. Thank you, Sister Raw, KW97, AP13 Keys, Each One Teach One, Anthony McPhail, The Forecast, and anyone else that came in to listen. I appreciate each and every one of you. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. Jackadera from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. And so many others. Welcome all my new subscribers. I thank you for subscribing to my channel. If you find any value in this content, please like, share, and subscribe. And let me know what else you want to hear. I do accept I do accept donations and I do accept recommendations for books. Every book that we read was once a suggestion that someone made. Now, whether they sponsor that book or not is up to them, but eventually we get to them all. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Peace.